Hi everyone. I think probably a lot of people were here from the last talk, but if you weren't here, I'm going to introduce myself and the organization a little bit before we get started. I'm Evan. I'm the current president of the UAMSA, or the University at Albany Mind Studies Association. Thank you for coming, and thank you for Dr. DCruz for your willingness to be here with us tonight. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that this talk and the Q&A session will be recorded, and it should be available on our YouTube page sometime tomorrow. So if you end up wishing that you took better notes, we have you covered. First, a little bit about the University at Albany Mind Studies Association. It is a registered grad student organization at the University of Albany, designed to bring together graduate students across departments who are working on research or interested in issues related to the mind. Our goal is to foster interdisciplinary dialogue, education, and collaboration on topics including, but not limited to, artificial intelligence, moral psychology, which is the topic tonight in a way, consciousness, perception, language. Sorry, I'm fielding the waiting room as well as reading this. Language, reason, rationality, music and animal cognition, and neuroethics. While we are a grad student organization, faculty and interested undergrads are always welcome to any and all of our events. And if you're interested in keeping up to date with what the organization is doing or with future events, the best way to do that is by subscribing to our email listserv. Many of you are already on the listserv, but instructions for how to subscribe, if you are not, hopefully will get posted in the chat at some point here. Undergrads and faculty are also welcome to subscribe. Subscribing to the listserv is especially important if you are a grad student, though, because anyone is welcome to come to events, but because we're a grad student organization, only graduate students get a say in deciding what those events are. And the only way to get a say is to attend the planning meetings, deciding what those events are. And the only way to attend those meetings is to see them advertised on the listserv. We also, as of very recently, have a Twitter account, which you can find at @UAlbanyMind. Hopefully, we can send a link to that in the chat as well. And we should be putting up notices of events there as well. All right, so the format tonight is that there's 30 minutes for the talk, which will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A. That's an open Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can indicate that you have a question in the chat by sending the word question. At which point you'll be added to the queue. We ask that you keep your mic off until Jeff, who is on our e-board, he's going to be fielding the questions, so he'll indicate that it's your turn to ask a question. You can also type your question directly into the chat and have Jeff ask it for you if you'd rather not turn your mic on, like, I don't know, if you have two terrible dogs that never stop barking like I do. So that's also an option. So finally, with us tonight is Dr. Jason DCruz. He is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Albany, Before that, he received his PhD in philosophy at Brown University. He works primarily in ethics and moral psychology and on topics like trust, promising, rationalization, and self-deception. He also has done work in bioethics, in particular on trust and consent, and the philosophy of art, in particular on fiction-directed emotion, imaginative resistance, and the autographic-allographic distinction. And the title for tonight's talk is, as you've probably seen at this point, Does the Trust Game Measure Trust? And with that, I'll hand the meeting over to Jason and we can get started.
Great. Evan, do you know if I'm able to share my screen? Am I a co-host? Can you make me a co-host?
You should be able to.
Not yet.
Let's see, now.
You might have to set me as a co-host.
Okay, I think I just changed it. Maybe that works.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Evan, for organizing this, for that kind introduction. Thanks a lot to the new UAlbany Mind Studies Association. I think this is a fantastic idea. It's great that it's being led by graduate students. I'm so happy that you're doing this. And I'm really touched that so many of you came out at 7 p.m. on a Thursday night. So I'm going to try to make it snappy, talk for maybe under half an hour, and just introduce really one new idea that is something I've been thinking about for the last few months, part of a book project that I'm working on right now, a very tiny part of it. And it has to do with, this part of it has to do with how psychologists think about trust and how to measure trust and how that might differ from what philosophers think about what trust is. And in particular, it has to do with this really, really pervasive paradigm in psychological research on trust called the BDM trust game. It stands for the people who invented it, Burke, Dickhout, and McCabe trust game. And this is an incredibly widely cited paper in psychology and behavioral economics. It has literally thousands and thousands of citations, and it is the dominant paradigm in social psychology, in behavioral economics, in getting a measure of trustingness and trustworthiness. So here, for those of you who haven't heard of this game before, I'm going to just briefly describe it. It's pretty simple. So it's a two-stage game, and there are two players in the game. The first is called the truster, and the second is called the trustee. The way it works is that person A, the trustor, is given an endowment of money from the experimenters, and they can choose what to do with that endowment. So in this example, they're given $50, and they can choose to just pocket the $50 and go home, in which case the experiment is over. Or else they can make another choice, which is to send their money, or some portion of their money, to another anonymous person who they have no contact with. And if they choose to send their money to this other person, they're told by the experimenters that the money will be multiplied by a certain amount. So in this case, the money will be multiplied by 6. And then the second person can choose either to keep all the money or give half of it back to the person A. And there are different versions of the game. There are binary and discrete versions. So in binary versions, you either decide to send all your money or none of it. And then as person B, you decide to send back half or send back none. And then in the discrete versions of the game, as person A, you can choose how much money you want to send. And then person B can choose how much money they want to return. But this is just the way of thinking about and modeling trust as a behavioral measure in psychology and in behavioral economics. Okay. So how do people actually end up playing the game? So in the first iteration of this game, when it was first published by Burke, Dickhout, and McCabe, they entrusted people with $10, and on average, persons A sent $5.16, that is slightly over 50% of the original endowment. And of the 30 people who received a transfer, 18 decided to send back at least $1. And of those 11 who sent back more than had been transferred to them, and of those, 11 sent back more than had been transferred to them, resulting in a profit for person A. And on average, investors who sent more than $5 got back more than they sent, while investors who sent less than $5 got back less than they sent. Which is kind of interesting. So you send more and you're more likely to get money back. And the game has been replicated over and over and over and over again, in particularly by Dunning and Fechenhauer. I think they're at Michigan right now. Dunning's at Michigan, or was it Michigan? So they do mostly binary games, not the discrete game that was the original BDM trust game. And they find that the large majority of persons B return half the money, somewhere between 80 and 90%, and that the result is surprisingly stable. So they're doing it cross-culturally, doing it in studies with students and managers, with children, with pensioners, and they find quite stably that most persons B return money. Okay, so why is this interesting? Well, First, it flies against classical economic theory that supposes that people are opportunistic and instrumentally rational actors. So if people were opportunistic and instrumentally rational actors, persons B would never send any money back, and persons A would know this, and so they also wouldn't send any money to persons B. But it turns out that persons A do send money, and persons B do send money back. You want to watch?
Let me get a food processor.
I saw that. I'll give you a talk right now. Okay. So it turns out that people do send money and that persons B do send money back. And so that is surprising. Maybe if you're a classical economist, that's surprising. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting about it is that before the invent of this trust game, the main method for measuring trust was just to ask people to self-report about their trustfulness. And so there was this general survey question that's given to people every year since 1972 by the General Social Survey. And it asked, generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? And so we had some interesting data from that, but we didn't have a behavioral measure of whether people would trust or respond with trustworthiness. So, psychologists, behavioral economists really cottoned on to this trust game as being, hey, finally, we have something better than self-report to measure trust and measure trustworthiness. Now, there have been some confounds in the trust game that have already been explored in the literature, and I'm not going to talk too much about these confounds, except just to flag that they've already been studied, and it's not exactly what I want to talk about. But so you might worry first that people send money just because they're being nice rather than being trusting. So it may just be that, when people send money, they're being kind and they send money because they want to, maximize overall utility or something like that. They know that the money's going to be multiplied and, no matter whether or not person B sends the money back, there's more money being sent out if they send money to person B. So maybe they're being kind rather than being trustful. There's some interesting studies on that that contrast the trust game with the dictator game. I can talk about that a bit in the Q&A as well. And then there's also maybe this worry that maybe people are sending money because they like to gamble and not because they are trusting. And there's some interesting work on that as well by people who study whether people are less likely to send to a random number generator than they are to a person. And it turns out that people are more willing to send money to people than some random process that, that decides whether or not the money is sent back. So those are a couple of interesting confounds that have already been investigated empirically, but my question is a little bit different. I have more of a sort of conceptual worry about the trust game. And my conceptual worry is about whether sending money in the trust game really means that you're trusting another person, and whether reciprocation in the trust game really is a mark of trustworthiness of the person who sends money back. And so I started to look at how psychologists understand what trustworthiness means, and I found a bunch of different sources. This was one of the most highly cited sources on just the question of what trust and trustworthiness is to psychologists. And here's a quotation that really struck me in their definition of trustworthiness. So trustworthiness is the willing of a person B to act favorably towards person A when A has placed an implicit or explicit demand or expectation for action on B. The implicit demand may entail a situation in which a child is drowning and B is expected to do something to save the child. Save the child, did I copy paste this wrong? That B drive with care and stop at a pedestrian crossing when A is on the road, or that B reward an investment made by A, like in the trust game. Okay, so I didn't copy paste that wrong, it's just a poor piece of writing. But, so when I read this sentence, what really struck me was how different the first two examples are from the third example. So the first example is saving a drowning child. The second is driving with care and stopping at a pedestrian crossing. And the third example is rewarding an investment in the trust game. And the third instance here seems really different in kind from the first two. In the first two, it seems clear that there is a weighty moral obligation to, for example, save the drowning child, or to drive with care and not run over someone at a pedestrian crossing. But it doesn't seem like there's any obligation in the trust game to reciprocate the investment that's made in you, or at least that was my sort of first sense. So I started to imagine that I was playing the trust game and I was person B. And actually I had an honors college class where I had students play this game a bunch of times, and I asked them about what it was like and how they decided what to do. But so imagine for a second that you are person B. So someone has sent money to you. They've sent their $5 to you, and that money has been multiplied by the experimenters. So now that $5 is 20. And you've got a choice to keep the $20 or to split it evenly with the person A. So you keep 10 and they keep 10. And you're thinking now, as the person B, what should I do? And really, I mean, I think I've been reading about this too much. I have no idea what I would do or what I would have done before I had thought about the trust game so much. But you know, maybe you think that you just maximize your profits and pocket the entire windfall, because maybe you think that it's a game, right? And it's a game with rules. I want to win the game. How do I win the game? I win the game by taking all the money at the end. So that seems totally reasonable to me. Or maybe you just want to be kind of nice and return some of the money that's sent your way. Maybe you think that you know, you could do someone a good turn, make somebody happy at very little cost to you by sending money back. Maybe, you know, you'll make a tiny difference in the world. But to me, it seems like there doesn't seem to be very much here to do with any kind of obligation. So here's some considerations. So first, you haven't made any promises or agreements or commitments, either within the scope of the game or outside of the game, to send money back, right? So it's never as if you receive this money because person A thought that you were committed to sending some amount of it back. And you haven't made any indications to person A that it's a wise choice to rely on you. You haven't invited their reliance in any way. And so my sense of it is that, and maybe the Q&A you can tell me whether or not you share the sense, that keeping the money is not any sort of betrayal. And so I don't think it's fair to say that persons B who hold on to the money in the trust game have shown themselves to be untrustworthy. And I think that is really a big conceptual problem with the trust game. So persons B who don't return money, they might be cheap. Maybe they're a bad sport. Maybe they're not the kind of person who you want to date. But untrustworthy just seems to be the wrong kind of concept here. Here's a way of trying to spell out why I don't think that persons B are being untrustworthy. So I think that sending money back as a person B is maybe a generous thing to do, but it's not morally required. So maybe it's a morally good thing, but we don't have an obligation to do that. And so I think it's in the category of, I've been mixed company here of both philosophers and psychologists, I think it's in the category of supererogation. That is that category of actions that are good, morally admirable, but that are not morally required. And I think that trustworthiness, on the other hand, is really about doing things that are morally required. That is, trustworthiness is about acting with integrity. And that, so I don't think that whether or not person B returns money is indicative of whether they're trustworthy. And that also causes problems for how we interpret persons A actions. Persons person A's actions. That is, it doesn't seem clear to me that since they're not now relying on a person's trustworthiness, that they're really trusting the person B. So maybe the trust game is not really about trust or trustworthiness at all. And that, I mean, so that's kind of bad news, but it is interesting to ask if the trust game isn't about trust or trustworthiness, because returning money in this game is not a question of trustworthiness. Then what is the trust game really about? I think that the trust game is really about a notion that's related to trustworthiness, but it's not trustworthy itself, which is the notion of counting on people. And the sort of most rough and ready gloss on counting on people that I came up with was just building into your plans that people will act in a particular way. And it is true that the trust game reveals what happens when people count on each other. And that's kind of interesting. I mean, so in the trust game, when persons B understand that persons A are counting on them, they're likely to reciprocate. And it's kind of interesting that persons A are open to counting on persons B. So we are often quite responsive to the expectations of other people. And this natural responsiveness that we have to the expectations of other people does reveal itself in the so-called trust game, if we want to call it the counting on game. But the reason why I really want to insist on the difference between a counting on game and a trust game is that counting on is really not the same as trusting. So you can count on a person without trusting them at all. So let's say, you're holding a meeting, and at the meeting there's going to be an important vote, but you know that some of the people who are going to vote at the meeting are going to vote in a way that's against what you want. But you also know that they tend to be late. So you decide to hold the vote at the very beginning of the meeting, counting on the fact that they're going to be late to the meeting. Well, you're counting on them here, but you're not trusting them, right? Or you might sort of count on someone to act in ways that are unbecoming because you want to demonstrate to others that they're unreliable. So you might count on someone to lash out in anger. Or maybe a sort of more commonplace example, you can count on people in ways that are manipulative, right? So you can count on people to, say, perform more than their fair share of the domestic duties at home, just in a way that sort of raises expectations and manipulates them into acting in that way. But counting on this way, I don't think, in this manipulative way, is not trusting. So counting on and trusting are really different from each other. But, I mean, that doesn't mean that all these experiments are for nothing and that we learn nothing from the trust game or its thousands and thousands and thousands of iterations. So we rename it the counting on game, and maybe the counting on game is kind of interesting in its own right. And I'm interested in some questions related to the counting on game. So I'm kind of interested in the question of whether we're more likely to think that people can be counted on when we find ourselves in positions of counting on them. So in these experiments, the way that they're usually set up is that a person makes a decision to count on someone or not. I think in real life, what happens more often is that we find ourselves in positions of reliance and vulnerability that we haven't chosen. And we need to decide how we feel about those positions of reliance and vulnerability. And I think that people often believe that people can be counted on as a result of finding themselves in positions of counting on others. That would be an interesting way of kind of developing the counting on game, I think. But getting back to our main question, so the main question is about the trust game and whether it measures trust. If I'm right and the trust game doesn't capture trust, I think it's interesting to ask, what would be a trust game that really successfully captured trust and trustworthiness? And my thinking on this, and I'm really interested to hear what you think about this, is that the trustworthy act would have to be something that's obligatory rather than supererogatory, right? It would have to be something that you had a moral obligation to do if we were really trying to test for trustworthiness. But the tricky part here, and this is why I'm so glad I don't actually have to do experiments, I can just suggest them, is that it's really hard in the lab to get people to display untrustworthiness, even if they know that they're being observed, right? How am I going to get people in the lab to demonstrate real untrustworthiness, or where there's a real chance that people are going to demonstrate real untrustworthiness? That is, they're going to fall short of their obligations. I mean, there are some studies like this in psychology involving cheating, where someone shows themselves to be untrustworthy, and we, really measure how much people cheat. But, for this game to really be a trust game where we can observe untrustworthiness, I think it would have to be a sort of situation where person B believes that they can break an obligation without being observed. And person A also believes that person B believes that they can break an obligation without being observed, yet we can still observe whether or not they're breaking an obligation. And that is hard. I don't think that it's impossible. I think it's going to take some creativity to come up with a game like this, but maybe we could. And if we could, that would be a game that deserved the title, the trust game. Okay, that's all.
All right, well, yeah, so with that, I guess we will open it up to comments and questions. And again, if you have a question, just send the word question in the chat. And I think that Jeff is keeping track of that and will call on you. And or you can ask your question directly in the chat if you would rather hear Jeff read it aloud in his very good reading voice.
All right, so we could start with Ariel. Go ahead, Ariel. Ask your question. Make sure you're
Hey,
unmuted.
how's it going? Sorry, it took me a while to unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can.
Okay. Hey, Jason, how's it going?
Hey, Ariel.
So that was great. I really enjoyed it. I think you're exactly right. I have no idea how anyone could think that that game measures trust. So I think that's exactly right. I just want to ask a question about your very last slide.
Mm-hmm.
And the notion of obligation. So I'm going to say something. I'm not sure if I believe it, but it kind of seems true. So I want to see what you think.
Yeah.
So my first reaction to your positive suggestion is that bringing in the notion of obligation might be necessary, but not sufficient to get you trust.
Mm-hmm.
So the kind of scenario I'm thinking is one where I'm thinking on my feet, so I'm not sure how to devise a game, but just think of a kind of game where you have, so let me rephrase it. I think I would make a distinction between obligations in general and directed obligations. So by a directed obligation, I have in mind something like a promise, like I promise you that I'll care for the plant right behind you. So
Yeah.
now not only do I have an obligation, but I owe it to you.
Mm-hmm.
And contrast that with a non-directed obligation, which is just, a kind of ought to comply with some rule where you don't owe that action to any specific individual.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so with that distinction, what I'm wondering is, if you just introduce the bare notion of obligation without direction, I wonder whether that just gives you a fancier version of the counting on game, right? So just think of maybe like someone playing a sport like soccer or baseball, where maybe the players can think of themselves as under an obligation to follow the rules. But when you break the rule, you don't you don't really owe it to any specific other players to do that. So I wonder whether players in that game can think of the other people in that game as basically on the counting on model, right? Basically, there's no trust there that the other person will act in a certain way, but you can kind of count on them because you know the, I know the rules, I know that you know the rules, you know that I know the rules, but there's really no trust. Whereas contrast that with maybe something like a promising game where you have the same structure, maybe the simple binary structure of the trust game, but now the whole game is couched in terms of like, if I give you this money, promise that you'll give it back, right? So now not only do you have an obligation to give it back when multiplied, if you are B and you receive this money, but now you can understand yourself as owing it to A. And there I could see you getting to more of a trust game. So basically my question is, do you think a mere obligation is sufficient to get you to trust, or do you think you need something more robust?
Yeah, that's a great question. So far I've only been thinking about in terms of this necessary condition of obligation.
Yeah.
And the trust game as it stands is missing what I think is a necessary condition for trust. And so the trust game doesn't capture trust, and that's I think safe. But yeah, this further question of whether or not it needs to be a directed obligation or it's just a general obligation, I'm really kind of on the fence. So when I ask the question, is a person trustworthy? Then it seems like all their obligations are relevant to this judgment of whether or not a person is trustworthy. But when it comes to the question, am I trusting this person? Then it seems like directed obligations are much more are more relevant. And I can count on people keeping all sorts of obligations. I think that I can make bets on it and count on them in that way. And maybe so let's say I'm thinking about whether or not people are going to keep their promises to repay loans. And I think it's a moral obligation to repay a loan. And I'm wondering about whether people are going to keep their promises to repay loans. And I make some bets on it. That is, I'm long on mortgage-backed securities, right? And so I'm counting on people keeping their obligations. It seems to me that falls short of trust, right?
Yeah. That's exactly
It does seem to fall short of trust. I don't think I want to say that you're trusting a person when you're counting on them to repay their loans if you're just betting on that. But I do think it makes sense to say that you judge them trustworthy insofar as you think that they are likely to pay the loans for moral reasons. Yeah. Thanks, Ariel. That's useful.
Okay, thanks, Ariel. Scott, you're next. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Jason, I really liked that talk. I thought it was great.
Scott, thank you for coming.
I have so I guess the short version of the question is what role risk plays in trust. And so the idea is that when we think about the difference in these two concepts, trusting and counting on, it looks to me, and I think some interesting empirical data that we probably don't have but would be interesting to get is whether or not risk is important to trust more for behavioral economists than it is for the general population. Because we know that risk is an important concept in behavioral economics. And it looks like that's something that's really important that they're measuring in the counting on game, right? Is just how risky is it for me to put this money out there. And it does seem like there's some kind of risk that's important to trust, but not in the same way. Like if you weigh risks when you decide whether or not to hold the vote at the beginning of the meeting, that's one thing. But if you weigh the risks too much on whether or not you trust your spouse to cheat on you or to not cheat on you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like you're no longer trusting them, right? So there's got to be like some like upper limit on how much risk assessment you're willing to bring into trust, right? And so I'm thinking that maybe an important difference in these two concepts is to figure out something about where that upper limit is. And maybe what happens is you shift into maybe counting on it just goes beyond what trust allows.
Yeah. So something that you said towards the end there sort of resonated with me, which is the thought that in trusting relationships, you can't think too much in terms of risks and rewards all the time, right? So like in thinking about whether or not to trust your spouse, you shouldn't go ahead and like start consulting statistics and base your decision on that. And certainly in the context of, in richer contexts in relationships, I don't think thinking in terms of calculative risk is consistent with that kind of rich trust. Now, the weird thing about the trust game is that it's so spartanly described that, you have no antecedent relationship with this person and you don't know anything about this person at all. So now in making my decision about whether or not to send money, it seems like I just can't help but think about this choice in terms of risk and what are my chances of getting back. And it seems like there's no more to the decision than this bald risk assessment. Whereas in the richer context of actual relationships, we think that thinking in those terms is kind of inconsistent with actually trusting someone, which I think is another reason why the trust game doesn't really deserve the mantle of the trust game, because it is so thinly described and the relationship is so thin that what counts as trusting doesn't seem to have enough meat on the bones.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Up next is Brad. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your
thanks. Hey, Jason. So when you were kind of severing the tie between counting on and trusting, it occurred to me that there's an element of trust that seems a little bit closer to counting on. And specifically, I was thinking about trusting that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you might say that, I count on phi to psi. In that case, I trust that phi will psi.
Mm-hmm.
So trust that seems, and I guess my question is about the relationship between trusting and trust that.
Yeah. Thanks, Brad.
Yeah.
I have never ever trusted phi to psi in my life. I don't trust phi at all.
But you trust that phi will psi.
Yeah. So,
if you count on phi to psi.
Right. I have counted on phi to psi occasionally. So I think that even when it comes to, say, counting on someone to do something, or trusting that, you still have mere counting on and not trusting that when the thing that you're counting on is something other than someone keeping an obligation, or if you want to go further, keeping an obligation to you. So if you're just merely, and I think, the examples of, say, counting on someone to be late to a meeting, when you count on someone to be late to a meeting, it's not that you trust that they're going to be late. Maybe you trust that in one sense of the word trust, right? in that you confidently expect them to be late. And that is sometimes a way that we use the word trust, which is part of what makes the discussion tricky, because we do use the word trust. It's totally understandable when someone says, like, I trust that someone is going to be late. All they mean when they say, I trust that someone is going to be late, is that they confidently expect that someone is going to be late. And that is a way that we use the word trust. But I think that way of using the word trust can be applied to all sorts of things. I trust that my car is going to start when it's -10. That also works. I just confidently expect that my car is going to start when it's -10. But there seems to be a really important difference between that kind of just predictive trusting that, and then the normatively laden trusting that, where we hold people accountable, we blame them, we feel guilty when we don't. That sort of trust that is enmeshed in all these reactive attitudes. And that's the kind of trust I don't think that the trust game captures. So maybe, a nicer way of putting it is that the trust game captures predictive trust, but not moral trust or normative trust. And that could be another way of saying it, instead of it
Trust that
captures.
doesn't have the normative component.
I think that's right. Yeah. Thanks, Brad.
All right. Thank you, Brad. Elizabeth, you're up. Unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, Jason and everybody. I have first a clarifying question and then maybe a question that will follow that. So when in the trust game, what information, can you just say again, maybe you said at the beginning and I missed it, but what is communicated to each of the parties in terms of their role in the trust game?
Definitely. Looking back, I should have gone back a little bit slower, especially people who haven't been working this trust game for, especially philosophers.
Or have forgotten it, like I
have. Right. So the way it works is that there are two people, person A and person B, and that person A is given an endowment from the experimenters. So they're given, say, $5. And then person A can decide what to do with the $5. They have two choices. They can hold on to the $5. If they choose that, the experiment is over. They walk out with the $5. Or they can choose to send their $5 to person B. And they're told by the experimenters that if they send their $5 to person B, that money will be multiplied by some factor. So let's say they're told that the money is multiplied by a factor of 4. So their $5 becomes 20. And then person B will be given the option to either keep all the money or to send some of it back to person A. So they could receive more money than they started out with if person B reciprocates, or they could end up with nothing. So the first choice, keeping the money, is the safe bet. You hold on to the money and you are assured of that amount of money. And then the second choice is the risky bet, where you put your money in the hands of person B and then you hope you're going to get even more back. And it was actually originally called the investment game by the original authors of the article, not the trust game, which I think it is more of an investment game than a trust game.
So even more specifically, so what is B told there? Like, does B know that A sent them the money, making this bet that they might get it back? Or does B have no idea, they just received money and they have to make a decision on what the right thing is to do or what the fair thing is to do? B
is told about the choice situation of A. So B knows that A was given exactly this choice. They don't know anything about why A made the choice that they did, but they do know that exactly what was told to A.
Okay. So the question I had essentially is, could there be a situation in which somebody is put into an obligation to be trustworthy, sort of without their consent or against their will? So if it were the case where, imagine the money came to B with a note from A saying, look, I'm really trusting you to return at least some portion of this money, because otherwise I would have made a big mistake. And so and again, this is the words trust versus counting on might be relevant here, and it might make it more tricky. But I'm wondering if there's that ability to sort of put somebody kind of without their consent and unwillingly into this obligation to be trustworthy, and if that would be a way of change in the game to make that happen. And then a further question, of course, would be then, and this I think might be obvious, if then B could say, yeah, trust me, I'll send it back to you.
Right.
And then clearly that seems like they've consented to a trusting relationship. But they're anonymous and they don't know each other and there's no consequences. And so what would each of those adjustments do to the game?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, maybe this is another route to altering the trust game so that it measures trust rather than counting on. So what if the way the game starts is that B is able to send A a message, and B is able to try to assure A that they will reciprocate if money is sent to them. And so you're told that, hey, you've got a chance to get sent some money, but you're gonna have to convince A or sway A to send you money. There's no guarantee that they're gonna send you money, so you're gonna have to do something. And I think that, a typical thing you do is you'll promise, if you send me the money, I promise I'm gonna send half of it back. And maybe that way of setting up the game would be closer to a real trust situation in which you do have an obligation because you've made a commitment to A to send half of the money back. That might get closer. I still think that there are sort of confounds here because thinking from the point of view of person B, this is not a natural, this is still quite an artificial circumstance. And I think you can still think of it as person B as just a game, right? I'm playing a game with someone else. In real life, I would never break my promises and break my commitments. But in the context of this fun game that we're playing, it's like we're playing Monopoly, and I'm going to try to maximize my profits, and I'll do everything I can to maximize my profits. And so it's not clear to me how persons B are going to interpret this. And maybe it depends a lot on framing. And there actually is some research on framing the trust game. And what they do is they call the trust game different things to persons A and persons B. They call it either the trust game or the dominance game or something. And when they call it the dominance game, then people are far less likely to send money and far less likely to reciprocate. But when they call it the trust game, people are. So that framing matters. Maybe something like that will happen too. So I think it's really delicate how you frame it to person B when you tell the person B, you have the opportunity to send a message to person A. Now, is that message telling them that you've got the opportunity to try to pull the wool over person A, to try to trick them and get as much money as possible because this is a dominance game? Or is this kind of a cooperation game and you're told you're going to try to get A to cooperate by sending them a persuasive message? Maybe that would be closer to something that would be a real trust game, but that's actually kind of a nice idea, is to start with person B instead of starting with person A and allow person B to send a message to person A to try to convince them by assuring them that they would send back some money. So that's useful. Yeah, maybe that's a way of adjusting the trust game so it really is about trust. So that was at least the second part of your question. I'm not sure if I got the first part.
And we can skip it if this doesn't seem useful, but I'm thinking if person A were to be able to communicate to person B, I'm giving you this money trusting that you will do the following in return. If that would place an, again, even without the consent, I think as a psychological matter, at least, if somebody said, look, I'm really trusting you to do this, I might feel, I didn't want you to trust me, but now that you're saying that you trust me, I kind of feel like I have to do this thing. And I never agreed to this, but now I'm in this position. And so I just wonder if there's something to that.
Yeah, I do think that that's what life is like, right? So sometimes you do find yourself in positions where you're being trusted and you wish you weren't being trusted in this way. So, you're sitting at the cafe in those days when we did sit at cafes, and someone tells you, oh my God, I've got a big emergency. I need to run out. I don't have time to pack up my laptop. Could you just, keep an eye on it for the next 10 minutes? I'll be right back, I swear. It seems like, you never agreed to this, but it still would be a bad thing to do to refuse to do it. And I think that there's a sense in which you are an untrustworthy person if you refuse to do it, even though there wasn't an explicit acceptance on your part of that obligation. So sometimes I do think that we're put under obligations that we don't explicitly accept. But still, I think the key here is that there is an obligation there, right? And it's only in the cases in which there is an obligation that we can sensibly speak about trust. And in the trust game as it is now, there is no obligation there. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Colby, you are next. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
I'll join everyone. Thank you as well for your talk. I thought it was very interesting. What I'm curious about is an idea about identity in the role of this experiment in the many different iterations it's taken in your own classroom or in any of these other examples you've given. And what I mean by identity is about any known identity between the participants, person A and person B, or possibly even maybe a step further, any pre-existing relationship.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking, like, even if, my understanding is that in these experiments conducted by maybe some of the psychologists that you cited were anonymous, right? Person A never even saw person B, right? They never even, saw what the person looks like. They never met them, never said hello even, right? Versus in your classrooms, when you do this with your students, they know each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thinking that, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, do you think that identity plays a role in knowing, knowing anything about the person's identity, whether visually, right? I see the person, maybe I see how well dressed they are, and I think, wow, that person's really rich. They give me $10, that I get to invest, and then I get to decide if I send the rich person back, any money, maybe not, right? Versus if I see the person and go, wow, they look like they might be homeless.
Mm-hmm.
They give me their $5 that they have, maybe I do send the money back, right? Or even if I know, even if I know the person, even if there isn't any difference in terms of the verbal exchange or instructions that are given between people, though I also think that that's an interesting variable that's been brought up. I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of the role of identity or relationship, as a possible variable, both in terms of how it might affect the outcome of the experiment, and in terms of how it might affect trust, if at all, the idea of trust, if you know the person or if at least you've seen them or spoken with them even about something that's unrelated to the game.
Yeah. So thanks, Colby. So Colby, you're in luck because there is a wealth of empirical investigation into the question of whether or not knowing or seeing some features of the person B's identity influences whether or not persons A send money, and also knowing about some features of persons A identity, whether that influences reciprocation on the part of person B. If you know that they're poor or rich, does that make a difference? There's a wealth of experiments on, facial trustworthiness. That is, what does their face look like, and exactly how many millimeters apart are their eyes, and whether or not the corners of their mouth turn up or turn down, and if that makes a difference in whether or not people send money and whether or not people reciprocate. And so there is a wealth of data about this kind of stuff. Some of it's kind of interesting, but the sort of, and there's also questions on research on reciprocated on iterative trust games versus single shot trust games. So if you know that you're going to play a trust game over and over and over with a person, are you more willing to send money and are you more willing to reciprocate? We do find that people are more willing to send money and to reciprocate in an iterative trust game than they are in a one-shot trust game, and that kind of makes sense. If you know you're going to be in this with the other person for the long term, you're more willing to send the money, and you're more willing to send money back. Another interesting thing is that you might think that if you were fully instrumentally rational, you would stop sending money in the last iteration or stop reciprocating in the last iteration, but people don't do that. People, even in the last iteration, keep sending money back once the relationship has been established. So those are all kind of interesting empirical nuances to and variations on the trust game. Whether or not that solves this fundamental problem, or sheds light on this fundamental problem of, does the trust game measure trust at all? I'm not sure. So if you were, the last one you asked is, if you're playing the trust game with someone who you knew, would that change things? And I think it might. There might be some conceptual features of the relationship. So let's say, I know, you're playing the trust game with me, and you know that I'm just really hard up for money right now. Or you're playing the trust game with me, and you know that, I don't have any cash on me, and banh mi costs $8, and I only have 5. And so if you, don't send the money back, then I'm not going to be able to buy a banh mi. Contextual features like that, I think, could bring real trust into the relationship. And what's kind of interesting about the trust game is all those contextual features are missing, which is, I think, reason to think that it's just about counting on, not about trust. Thanks.
Thank you, Colby. Rachel, you are next. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
I guess I've succeeded in unmuting myself. Hooray. Great talk, Jason. I didn't know anything about the trust game before this, and you've convinced me that it's not really about trust. And I like the distinction between counting on and trusting, but I have a couple of concerns. So I'm going to try to ask two sort of half-baked questions. The first is related to the sort of stuff that you were talking about with Colby. This reminded me a little bit of Prisoner's Dilemma games and related cheating games and iterated Prisoner's Dilemma games, and whether people defect or not and rely on one another to not defect. And so I wondered, so I'll throw this out there and go on to not take too much time with it. I wondered, you mentioned that there have been cooperation versus cheating games, and so you thought maybe there had been some games where people were doing something they knew was immoral, or that they knew failed to fulfill their obligation, even though experimenters were watching them. And I wondered why you think that that's not, and I remember these games very poorly, so if they're fresh in your mind, you probably have a good answer, but I wondered why you thought that wasn't that wouldn't be a good example, or at least a good model for a genuine trust game. So that's one. The other one is about, as I said, I like the distinction between trusting and counting on, but then I started getting a little worried about it. So what you claim is necessary for trusting rather than merely counting on is that there be a moral obligation at stake. And I thought, well, wait, when I expect most people to obey the laws in a country, for example, am I trusting them or only counting on them? And does whether I trust them or count on them depend upon what motives they have or what reasons they have for obeying the law? Am I counting on them merely if, for example, I expect them to obey the law because I expect them to want to avoid penalties? Am I trusting them when I expect them to obey the law out of a sense of obligation? Is that what we're looking for? And then one more example, and then I'll give you a chance to answer. The other example is about trusting one's children when they get older, when they're older teens or young adults, and we trust, or we sometimes trust our children to look after their own interests, right? What is my adult child going to do about blah, blah, blah? Well, never mind, I'm not going to interfere. I trust him to take care of himself. Because that sounds to me like trust, and it doesn't sound to me like there's a moral obligation at stake.
Yeah. Nice. Thank you, Rachel. Those are really good questions. I'm just jotting them down so that I remember them. So I'll start with the last ones first. What about, so I claim that what distinguishes trusting from counting on is that there's a moral obligation, but it makes sense to think of in terms of trusting your children to take care of themselves, and there's no moral obligation there. Yeah. So what I said in response to Brad was that there's a difference between predictive trust and moral trust. And with predictive trust, all we have is the confident expectation, whereas moral trust is enmeshed in all these reactive attitudes of holding people responsible and feeling guilty and being angry. Now, this case seems to be kind of halfway between the predictive and the moral. That is, when you trust your son to take care of himself, you're expressing confidence in his ability and motivation to take care of himself. And if he fails to take care of himself, his interests are going to be set back. But maybe also importantly, your interests are going to be set back because you care about him so much. And so there's a sense in which he's letting you down by failing to take care of himself as well. And I wonder if that's enough, that there is something of a moral obligation for him to take care of himself. I mean, some people think we have moral obligations to ourselves, right? To do things like take care of yourself. But even if you don't think that there's that, maybe it's something like his obligation to not let himself fall apart because that would break your heart. And that's enough to speak in terms of normative trusting as opposed to mere predictive trusting, mere predictive counting on. So maybe that's what I want to say about that example. What about counting on people to obey the laws? So counting on people to avoid penalties, is that trusting them? Yeah, and does it depend on their motivation? That is a good question. So let's say in a case where you think that someone is going to do their moral obligation just because they are terrified of you. So you know that they're going to keep their promise to you because they're really scared of you, right? That's the explanation for why they're going to, you've intimidated them so badly that they're always going to keep their promise. You're the mafia boss, and you know, they're the person low on the ladder, and you really confidently expect that they're going to keep their promise to you. Do you trust them or merely rely on them or count on them? I think in that case, you just merely count on them because you know what's motivating them is fear. And if the fear weren't there, then you know they might totally screw you. If they thought they could get away with it, then they would screw you. And I'm sort of tempted to say the same thing about thinking that people will only obey the law because of the sanction of violating it. That if you think that if people thought they could get away with, say, stealing from you or abusing you, they would do it. But it's because of the law that they don't. Then I think that even if you count on them not to steal from you or abuse you, you don't trust them because you think that there's not sufficient motivation apart from the law. So I think that's a direction which I'm tempted to go in. So it's not just the presence of the obligation. It's got to be something about their motivation as well to do what they're obligated to do. So that,
yeah,
maybe
that's interesting. Yeah, I thought you might. Well, that's why I suggested that. I thought you might want to go in that direction. I want to go back for just 1 second to trusting your young adult child to look after themselves and say, I don't know. I think I could trust my son to look after himself. without necessarily being confident that he's going to make a good decision. I'm not sure that that's counting on. I may not be counting on him to make a good decision, but I decide I'm not going to meddle because I'll trust him. So, and I'm also a little worried, and I'm sure you feel this too. Yeah, maybe one has a moral obligation not to break one's mother or father's heart, but I'm reluctant to say the young person's responsibility to look after them is a moral obligation to mom. You have a responsibility to go to the doctor when you need to, or to get your teeth cleaned regularly, and that's an obligation to mom. That seems like a bad direction to go.
That seems right. It's just like that seems they're still thinking about it as an obligation to mom. Yeah. There's a problem there. Right?
That's a problem.
that does seem right. But yet you want to say that, so I think you're right, that it's not primarily an obligation to you, but it is trust, and that trust is something over and above counting on. And what makes you resist wanting to say that? Well, then it's just counting on. If there's no obligation, then it's just counting on. What is it about this case that pushes you in the direction to think that there's something more than counting on there?
It feels like there is trust here, even without a moral obligation. That was the point of the example. And part of it is that there's something important at stake, and there is a risk, and there is a it's hard to say why. It's the word trust feels right here. Okay, I really want to call him up and remind him to do this thing that every adult knows they need to do, but I won't because I trust him, or I won't interfere. I mean, depending on the age of the young person, right? If it's your child is a college student and they're struggling with a course, and parents sometimes do this. They email the professor and intercede on behalf of their child because they don't trust their child to talk to the professor and take care of him or herself. A parent who is tempted to do that might say, no, I trust you to handle this yourself. It feels to me like not just, yeah, I assume you will. Counting on is more expectation. It's more assumption that the person will behave a certain way. Trust sounds more like, well, like trust. That's all I got.
Yeah, no, I share some of that feeling. And part of what seems to be driving it is that you care so much about this person, right? So if it were just, somebody else's kid who you didn't really know or care about or even like all that much, it doesn't seem like it'd be so clearly in a case of trust. But in this case, because you care about the person so much, it does seem to make sense to speak in terms of trust. But I'm wondering whether or not, to the extent that it makes sense to speak in terms of trust, it also makes sense to think in terms of trust betrayed. And if it makes sense to speak in terms of trust betrayed, then I'm seeing less resistance to thinking in terms of obligation, and that your child has an obligation, maybe to themselves or maybe to you, I'm not sure, because I see the problem of thinking that it's all about obligation to you. But yeah, that's a really interesting case. I have to think about that more. I just saw in the comments over here, we've got some time concerns.
Sorry, I feel like I've been taking too much time.
Thanks, Rachel. I didn't get to your first part, but I'll get back to
Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. On next is Alex Q. Go ahead and answer your question after unmuting yourself.
Hi, Jason. I generally found myself in agreement with a lot of the stuff that you said, and we talked about trust a lot in the moral psychology seminar that we had. So when you mentioned that disappointing psychological typological definition of trust, which I was very dissatisfied with. You had said that the investment example was very different from the other two examples, which I certainly agree with. You had said that in your view, there was no obligation for person B to return any money invested by person A.
Yeah.
It seems to me that when we use the word investment, there is a belief, one that involves trust, that we expect some reciprocity. So I'm wondering how you might respond to the notion that some moral component really is kind of baked into the element, because I think that it seems like trust and belief have an awful lot to do with each other, and it seems like in this case there would be trust in this belief. And to me, so I don't fully disagree that there's no obligation. I think it's going to be contextual, but it's hard for me to completely accept that there wouldn't be.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've been worrying about this exact same question. So as person B, are you doing something bad by not sending money back? Are you, I mean, obviously person A has got the expectation that you're going to send some money back, and you're frustrating that expectation. But in the trust game, because it's so bare, I'm not even sure if it really, deserves to be called reciprocity here. So as person B, I think, why did person A send me money? Did they send me money because they liked me? Did they send me money because they're trying to do me a good turn? I think it's likely they sent money to me because they thought they had a better chance of getting more money as a result of sending money. And if I think that that's the only kind of reason that person A might have to send money, then I don't see a reason as a person B to think that I have any obligation to reciprocate. And so, I mean, what I was thinking is that, the failure to reciprocate as a person B, and I guess it would be really interesting to just get data on people's reasons for failing to reciprocate. How did they think about the situation? How do they think about their refusal to send money back? But the way I'm thinking about it now is that, it could be a nice thing to do to send money back. Or, I could take the money that was sent to me and give it to somebody else, right? And that would be just as kind as giving it to the person A. And, there would really be no difference in how kind those things were. But there still isn't any sort of anywhere near the kind of obligation that would be necessary in order for my failure to do it to be a mark of untrustworthiness. Alex, do you have the sense that, so the failure to send money back, we've got too many questions here, but so yeah, that's my answer to your question, is that failure to send money back is just going to be insufficient to think that someone is acting untrustworthily, because there is no obligation there, especially because you've got no knowledge of A's reasons for sending money. And you've never made any assurance to A that you would send money back, and A has never asked for any assurance, and you've never invited the reliance of A. Makes me think that there just is no obligation here.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. I think it's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Next up is Evan. Go for it.
Yeah, so I was curious, I don't really know that I even have a fully formed question, but something along the lines of, it seems like a lot of what's going on is we're talking about moral obligations and about kind of contextual information that people would have in relationships, right? And individuals trusting other individuals, or what Ariel called direct or something directed. And I know that a lot of people, especially right now, but like Pew does a bunch of research polls on this question, and people talk about trust in institutions. They talk about government, but they also talk about science, like scientists writ large, and trust in scientists. It doesn't seem like we would think that, I don't even know what the particular issue is there, but it doesn't seem like it would be a moral obligation that we're expecting of scientists. And so I didn't know if we felt like maybe there is some way to make sense of that in terms of a moral obligation, or is it just that they're wrong about trust, or that, the folk theory is just not sufficiently nuanced. I don't know, I was just curious what you thought about something like trust in institutions?
Yeah, I think trust institutions is super interesting. And we can't derive a theory of trust institutions just directly from the trust in individuals. But that said, I do think many of the features of trust in individuals are also present when it comes to trust in institutions. So you care that institutions are transparent. You care that there are mechanisms in institutions to prevent dishonesty. You care that the people who are running those institutions are competent. Those are all sorts of considerations that go into whether or not you feel that you can trust an institution. And those are also sometimes considerations that go into whether you can trust a person, right? Whether that they are competent, whether they're honest, whether that they are willing to be transparent to you about what their reasons are and what their motivations are. So I think that, some of thinking about trusting individuals can be transferred to thinking about trust in institutions. And I don't know, a bit about moral obligations. So when I think about whether or not I trust the CDC with approving or disapproving a vaccine, some of what I'm thinking about is their competence, but then I'm also thinking about whether or not they are being forthright with the public when it comes to their assessment of the data, and whether or not the thresholds for safety that they claim that they are committed to are in fact the thresholds of safety that they'll use when it comes to deciding whether or not to approve the vaccine. It seems like something like obligations to honesty and also integrity are at play there. There's lots of complications, like what does it mean for an institution to have integrity? What does it mean for an institution to be honest? Apart from the individuals in the institution having integrity and the individuals in the institution being honest? That's a really interesting question, and doesn't follow straightforwardly from individual to group case. But I do think that some of the same questions are there.
And I should also say that when they do those kinds of studies, a lot of times they say public trust in institutions. They don't talk about, and a lot of times it's not about particular issues, it's just trust generally in the institution. I didn't know if that was something that only, this kind of institutional trust is just something that emerges from like public aggregate, like public trust. It's not like we're not going around, technically we're going around asking individuals, but we're measuring public trust, not individual trust in the institution. So I don't know if that matters at all or not. But
yeah. So is public trust just an aggregate of the trust of all the individuals that comprise the public, and is the trust, the integrity of the institution, just the aggregate of the integrity of all the individuals in the institution, or does it have something to do with structural features of both the public and structural features of the institution? I don't have a quick answer to that question, but it's a good thing to think about.
Thank you, Evan. And the last question for the evening will be Andrew. Go for it.
Hey, Jason, thanks so much for the talk. Really enjoyed it.
Andrew, good to see you.
Yeah. So I had a question that was pushing a little bit on the trust and count on distinction as well, because sometimes I feel like we use them pretty synonymously.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was thinking of like a high stakes situation, for example, like in wartime. It seems like we could have a scenario in which, let's say we have an army and everybody said they're counting on one of the soldiers to carry out a critical function to help in the war effort. So for example, we could say, we're counting on Joe to create a diversion at the proper time. We could just as easily say, we're trusting Joe to create a diversion at the proper time.
Mm-hmm.
And so in both cases, it seems like there's a weighty obligation on Joe, but we can use either term. So I guess my intuition is that, when we're talking about cases where you can only use one or the other, I think what you said about obligation makes a lot of sense. But it does seem like there's some cases where we can use both. And I was wondering whether trust is just a species of counting on, that maybe that's what trust is just a counting on with obligations, something else. And we could just, in many cases, we could just say counting on, we're just not being as specific.
Yeah, yeah, that's a nice example. So I do think that sometimes when we say we're counting on Joe, we really do mean that we're trusting Joe. And those would be the cases in which we're counting on Joe to do what he's obligated to do for the reason that he's obligated, I think. So there could be cases of counting on Joe to create the diversion where we're counting on him, but that falls short of trust. So let's say like there's just something about Joe that's really distracting to the enemy. And we know that when like we send Joe out in the field, Joe's a celebrity. And so we're counting on the fact that, the Russians really like Joe and Joe's movies. They'll be distracted by him when he's out in the field. Then we might count on Joe to create the diversion in a way that falls short of trust, just like some feature of him that is distracting to the other people. Or we might count on him to create the diversion thinking that the reason why we can count on him is that he's really terrified of the punishment of not playing his role. And so if we think that exhausts why we can count on him, is that he's so afraid of the punishment for not playing the role that he's supposed to play, but that we also thought that were it not for this punishment, he would totally not play the required role, then I think we could say that we don't trust him, but we're counting on him. So that I think that's right, that there are some cases of where we say that we're counting on someone, but we really do mean that we're trusting them. And then some cases where we're counting on people and we're just merely counting on them. And I think that the trust game case is a case of just merely counting on somebody.
So real quick follow-up. Would you say then that trust fits neatly in the broader category of counting on, or would you say there are some cases that you can trust someone but not count on them?
So I want to say counting on isn't sufficient for trust, but are there cases where you trust people but you don't count on them at all? When I was first making that slide, I did make that claim, and then I said, oh God, that's gonna get me, people are gonna ask questions about that, and I don't even say that, so I'm not gonna include that on the slide. My first thought is, yeah, you can trust people and not count on them. So it could be that, I fully think that you're trustworthy, but I just don't have occasion to trust you. So, let's say there's nothing that you can help me with. At the moment, at least. Maybe at some point in the future, there's something you can help me with, but right now, there's nothing that you can help me with. On the other hand, I fully think that you are a stand-up person and that you always keep your promises and that you have a lot of integrity. And so if I were asked, like, do I trust Andrew? I totally trust Andrew. Am I counting on Andrew? Not for anything in particular, just because our relationship right now I have nothing that I need to count on you for. So I do think it makes sense to speak in terms of trusting somebody, but not counting on them.
Great, thanks.
All right, okay, so I guess we're out of time. I think we might have actually run over, but I think everybody was into it, so we're good. Thanks again for coming, and if you're interested in the topic of imaginative resistance, you should know that our last talk of the semester is on December 11th at 6 p.m. and will feature Brendan Gazer from the psychology department talking about imaginative resistance. And you can use the same link that you used for this meeting to attend, and I will also be sending a reminder out on the listserv. So if you're on that, then you don't even have to remember this link, because I'll do it for you. So thanks again for coming. And that was, thanks again, Jason, that was a really great talk. So.
Thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate all the time that you've come to talk about the work. And it reminds me of how much I miss everybody, and I miss meeting my colleagues in the hallways and my students and friends in the hallways just to talk about philosophy. So I really appreciate it. Thank you guys.